The heat of the offseason is now underway for the Seahawks. Could there be an exodus oncoming on the coaching staff? We're going to dive into a couple reported assistants looking at coordinator jobs and the latest dominoes to fall on Mike Macdonald's staff here on our Thursday edition, Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in, whether you're in Pasco, Washington, or Cordoba, Argentina. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week and helping the Locked On Podcast Network become the #1 sports podcast network. The Super Bowl parade now in the rearview mirror. The Super Bowl in the rearview mirror. It is time to tackle the offseason. Believe it or not, we're going to be full steam ahead now, looking towards everything from free agency to reserve, future contracts, all the ongoing coaching rumors and interviews out there. We're going to be diving into all of that today, starting with the offensive free agents for the Seahawks. We've got some reserve future deals to break down and the latest on the coaching front on Mike Macdonald's staff, who may be here and who may be leaving. All that coming your way here. So let's get to it. Now for your lead story on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Mike Macdonald now can shift his focus with the parade in the rearview mirror towards building his staff for the 2026 season. Interviews expected to start today with offensive coordinator candidates and run through tomorrow, at least the internal candidates on Seattle's roster. And other teams are still trying to build their staffs as well, which puts some extra pressure on Mike Macdonald. Not only Clint Kubiak with the Raiders, former offensive coordinator, potentially plucking coaches off Seattle's staff, but there are still other teams that need to fill big roles, including the Arizona Cardinals in the NFC West. They just hired Mike LaFleur as their new head coach before the Super Bowl. And Rob, now he's trying to steal from a division rival, potentially Carl Scott, who you and I have viewed as a potential favorite to get the defensive coordinator job in Vegas. He interviewed yesterday with the Arizona Cardinals for their vacant defensive coordinator job. And Frisman Jackson, the receiver coach for the Seahawks, that's the first internal name that's now being looked at by the Raiders, and Clint Kubiak, who those two hit it off well. Frisman Jackson getting an interview with the Raiders later this week for their offensive coordinator job. So the wheel is starting to turn when it comes to that coaching carousel for the Seattle Seahawks. And when these dominoes start falling, there's going to be a bunch more that fall as well, both for keeping assistants and losing them on Mike Macdonald's staff.
Yeah, I think that Seahawks fans had better bask in the glow of the Lombardi Trophy for as long as possible. But the decision makers at the Virginia Mason Athletic Center cannot afford to bask much longer because, as you said, Corbin, whether it be the coaches that are going to get basically pilfered from this roster or the players themselves, as we'll be talking about in free agency, there's going to be an awful lot of the 31 NFL teams out there who are going to basically be trying to get their grubby little hands all over Seattle's prized assets in the coaching and player ranks. And I think that it's going to start there with Carl Scott, as you mentioned, getting his opportunity with the Arizona Cardinals, obviously a team he's going to know very, very well. And so I expect that he is going to interview very, very well. That's a very real possibility that Seattle could lose him, as we discussed in yesterday's show. Same thing with Frisman Jackson. I mentioned him yesterday as a player that I thought Seattle was going to try to prioritize to keep, but obviously Clint Kubiak is going to know Frisman Jackson as well as anybody. Frisman Jackson's success with Seattle's receivers this year goes beyond just JSN. It really was a remarkable year. Consider the impact that Torrey Horton was having, a rookie, a fifth-round rookie at that, was having. Again, there's an awful lot of success or a lot of credit that needs to be spread around, but Frisman Jackson deserves some of that as well. I also think, again, that it was a very strategic move by the Seahawks to basically mention that they were going to be doing their interviews today, Thursday, as well as Friday, with Andrew Janocko, Justin Outen, Jake Peets, and Mac Brown. By mentioning those four individuals, obviously all of them are intrigued by the possibility of being offensive coordinator somewhere. But if you're on the Super Bowl team, and the relationships that they have built with the players and the other coaches, I think that was, kind of a preemptive strike by the Seahawks to try to keep all four of them on the staff. Whether that works or not, who remains to be seen. But I think that's one of the reasons why that you were seeing so-called others getting the very first reported interviews, other than Clint Kubiak, of course.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned the strategy behind it. Seattle's trying to get out in front. Mike Macdonald wants that continuity. Hey, these are the four coaches that we are taking a very close look at. Now, Clint Kubiak is also very aware of all these guys. He has coached with them, so that does not mean that these four coaches here, they're going to interview with Seattle and then they're just going to sit idly on their hands. Well, let's see if I get it or not. There's going to be other interviews with Clint Kubiak, and I'm expecting several of these coaches are going to be looked at for that offensive coordinator job in Vegas. And it's going to be one of those things where Seattle probably wants to try to make the hire first because they want to be the ones that set what dominoes fall, not Clint Kubiak. And so I mentioned it yesterday. I expect that this is going to go very quickly. This is not going to be 6 weeks from now, Ryan Grubb's eating at Dino's type thing. Like that's not what is going to be happening here. They are going to be making a hire quickly. And I think a lot of it has to do with that domino effect. And we talked John Benton yesterday. I'm reiterating what I said yesterday. I feel very strongly that John Benton is going to be on this Seahawks staff next year. But what happens with the offensive coordinator situation could have a bearing on that. And that's why I believe Justin Alton probably has the inside edge for this, because Justin Alton and John Benton this year worked together a ton with run game coordinator and offensive line coach, and then Alton becoming the running back coach the second half of the year for Kennedy Palomalu. Those two were working together in conjunction to get this run game rolling the way that it did in the second half into the playoffs. And they worked together a ton before that. So assistant offensive line title was Alton's for the first half of the year. So these two guys work really well together. And I think Alton being the play caller is his promotion, and Benton getting to continue doing what he likes to do, coaching a very young, talented offensive line. That still to me seems like the most likely thing that the Seahawks are going to do, but they're going to look at all these different coordinator options to make sure that they pick the right one. You go a different direction, it could maybe alter some of the guys that end up leaving. But I do think there's one other thing that helps the Seahawks retaining John Benton, because I thought one other thing that might lead him to leave, if he became the assistant head coach in Vegas, if that was offered to him to be the elder statesman coach, so to speak. But that is not going to be the case. Mike McCoy, who most recently was the Titans interim head coach this year, has been an offensive coordinator and a head coach for a long time in the NFL. He is the Leslie Frazier now for Clint Kubiak in Vegas. So that job is no longer available. I can't see a lateral move for John Benton going to Vegas. So I'm going to keep pushing that I'm not saying it's impossible. He could absolutely still do it because of his friendship with Kubiak, but what Seattle does here with the OC position, it might not even matter with those four candidates because John Benton's worked with all of them, and it feels like he is being pulled to stay there with the talent they have.
Yeah, and just really quickly, I mean, I am wearing, black and silver after all. I guess I'll just make the quick comment as far as I like the Kubiak went with McCoy. I just think that is some experience as head coach that I think is going to be, very helpful for Kubiak. And so I do think that was a quality hire. From Seattle's perspective, look, I think that Justin Alton's going to be a terrific OC when he gets his opportunity. I'm just not convinced that Seattle has made him the overwhelming favorite at this point, just because Janocko, I think, very much is in play, as well as Peets and Brown. Janocko with the success that he had at the quarterback position, I just think that is important. Just to kind of acknowledge that. I think that the way that he sees, the plays developing and his ability to, kind of counter what the defense does is something that is very well respected in the industry. Same thing with Peets. I mean, basically exact same thing when Peets, as far as the feedback that I've been getting from other teams, and then Mac Brown, as we talked about yesterday, Corbin, just the development that he has shown. His work in the red zone is very much is very well respected also. I love the fact that you mentioned with Justin Alton for a moment, however, just that, when Kennedy Polamalu stepped aside, and Alton took over that job, working a little bit more directly with the running backs. And obviously, Kenneth Walker III is a pending free agent. Maybe that relationship does work a little bit in your favor. And, Kenneth Walker III is going to be looking to get as much money as he possibly can, understandably so. The iron has never been hotter than it is a Super Bowl MVP. But at the same time, this is a team that has always prioritize relationship building during the John Schneider era, and that certainly hasn't changed now with Mike Macdonald as head coach. So I do think that that is the most likely scenario. Again, Alton as OC, but I also think that the Seahawks, as much as I want to agree with you that it's going to be a 2 or 3 or 4 day process, it's going to be over pretty quickly, and we're not going to see anybody at Dino's in a month from now. I do think that their decision is not based on speed. I think that they are feeling pretty confident right now. Their decision is based on making sure, obviously, you get the right hire, not necessarily the first hire.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that speed is going to be necessarily prioritized. I just, listening to what Mike Macdonald has said and people I've talked to, they've already been having these discussions for weeks because they knew Kubiak, there was a good chance he was going to get a head coaching job. So these conversations were not just starting after the parade yesterday. They have had a lot of discussions with coaches on their staff already. And I think that confidence is going to lead to a quicker decision rather than just saying that it's rushed, that they are going to be able to make this decision quickly because they are confident in the candidates they have and the game plan they have for building this staff. When we come back, the Seahawks signed a bunch of players to future and reserve deals today. That might not seem like a big deal, but Tayakata may have something to say about that. We are going to be looking at that list of signings and discussing which players we are most excited about in 2026 for the Seahawks. That'll be coming up next year on our Thursday edition, Locked On Seahawks. Tax season doesn't have to take over your life. This year, TurboTax is making it easier than ever to just hand things off and move on with your day. With TurboTax full-service experts, you can have your taxes done for a trusted local expert, start to finish, without the stress or guesswork. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They handle everything from the W-2s to self-employed forms and work to get you every deduction. It's a huge time saver and gives real peace of mind knowing an expert is handling it. For a limited time, you can have your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150. All in if a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year. Just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life. Visit TurboTax.com/local to book your appointment today. Welcome back to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. He's Rob Rang. A special thanks to all the 12s who are listening in, and thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate your support of the show. You already live your team every day. Now take it up a level and go ad-free by joining the Everydayer Club today. Get Locked On Seahawks with no interruptions, members-only Discord access to speak with our local Locked On hosts and more, all for just $5 a month or $50 a year. And to sweeten the pot until February 15th, just enter in the word CHAMPS as the code. You get the first month free for the Everydayer Club. That's the word CHAMPS at Locked On Seahawks at Supercast or .supercast.com. That's Locked On Seahawks .supercast.com, or check out the link in the show notes to learn more. All right, Rob, it is on to the 2026 season. I know that everybody wants to talk Super Bowl, and look, I'm sure we'll reference plays from that game for the next 6 months. That's the way that it goes when you win the big one. But Seattle's interested in the dynasty business. So we need to start looking at the offseason and figuring out what the Seahawks are going to be doing. And the first move that always happens right after the year ends, whether it's after the regular season when you miss the playoffs or after winning the Super Bowl, it doesn't matter, signing players to reserve future contracts. And today the Seahawks announced 15 signings on that front. Several running backs, Cam Akers, Velus Jones Jr., Jacardia Wright, 3 receivers, and Tyrone Broden, Ricky White, the 7th-round pick out of UNLV, Montori Foster, couple offensive linemen, Logan Brown, Federico Moranguez, defensive linemen, J.R. Singleton and Bubba Thomas, hybrid edge inside linebacker, Jamie Sheriff, inside linebacker Chris Paul Jr., as well as Jamarcus Weston, cornerback Tyler Hall, and safety Maxon Hooks. So a lot of practice squad guys and a lot of guys who played significant snaps this year at some point for the Seattle Seahawks, and a few guys on there like Cam Akers that have played a lot of snaps in the league in general. So you've got a blend of inexperienced developmental players and some veterans here being brought back on future deals. And looking at this list, the guys that have been signed to these future reserve deals that are now on the new 90-man roster, I'm going to call this the Tayakata rule from now on, because he might be the most prominent example here in the last 5 or 6 years of a player who was a future reserve deal signee. He actually was 2 different seasons in a row to start his career a future reserve deal signee. Mostly was on the practice squad, and then this year he started 13 games for the Seattle Seahawks with the injuries they had and played fantastic football to the point that it might push Kobe Bryant out of town. They might move forward with Tayakata as their third safety this year in 2026 because of how well he played and the fact that he is going to be an exclusive rights free agent, cheap, affordable to sign, club control for the next 2 years. That's something to keep in mind here. But he was on a list just like this last year, Tayakata was. So I want to talk about the guys that we are most excited for 2026. Like, who could be that Tayakata, or at least somebody that makes the jump to the 53-man roster after most of being practice squad or bouncing on and off. Let's talk about the guys we are excited about from this list.
Sure. I think that if we're going to talk about the players I'm most excited about, then I'm always going to go towards the athletes. And the 2 elite athletes, in my opinion, of this list, one of which who tested as such, another one who did not. The running back, Velus Jones, he is a guy who's a 4.3 speed guy. We've talked about him before. His ability as a runner, as a returner, as a possible receiver, the way that Seattle used JSN out of the backfield. I wonder if you couldn't do things like that with Velus Jones, who again has the hands to be a wideout as well. As a return man, and with the free agent status, of course, of Rashid Shaheed, I think that Velus Jones makes an awful lot of sense as kind of a backup. And similarly, Chris Paul Jr., the linebacker, he is a guy that just flows. When on the field, he can absolutely fly to the football. He is undersized. He reminds me a little bit of Ernest Jones, back in his collegiate days, in that he doesn't have that classic, thumper middle linebacker, short, squatty kind of a frame. He's kind of lean in the, narrow in the hips, narrow in the shoulders, and doesn't look like a traditional middle linebacker, but plays that type of physicality and the speed. And so to me, he is another one that it's very intriguing of that list. And finally, I would mention Logan Brown, the offensive lineman, as well. To me, he is a very intriguing developmental talent. And while I don't think that he necessarily has an easy path to a starting job, of course, because Seattle's starting 5 offensive line are of course already under contract, with Josh Jones potentially on the way out as a free agent deal, as you mentioned before with Kobe Bryant, with Tayakata and Kobe Bryant. I could see the same kind of scenario playing out for Logan Brown for Seattle as well.
Yeah, those are all players that I had on my short list, but they weren't at the top of my list. And I want to start with a guy. Ricky White is going to have to deal with the numbers game. That is going to be the issue once again, especially assuming that Rashid Shaheed, and we should make an assumption at this point that he's back in a Seahawks uniform. But if he is back in a Seahawks uniform, you are going to have a healthy Torrey Horton coming back. Jake Bobo, we'll see. I expect that the Seahawks are going to find a way to bring him back. I mean, you're starting to get into a little bit of a hairy situation if you're a receiver trying to carve out a role. But this guy was such a good special teams player at UNLV. And I thought he started to show some things late in training camp. It was a little too late to push for a roster spot, but the Seahawks are still very excited about Ricky White. And we know the college production, the toughness, the special teams ability. I could see him being a guy that jumps in and finds a way to get onto the roster and play some significant snaps in his second season in the National Football League. On defense, I want to circle J.R. Singleton. And this was a guy who I thought had an outside chance of making this football team coming out of training camp. He didn't play in any games in the regular season, but he was on the practice squad the entire year. That is always something that I put on my criteria, because if it's a guy that bounces on and off, those, Cody White is an exception to that rule. But most of the time, guys that bounce on and off the practice squad, they're not going to be the ones that make that jump where they are consistently on the 53. Tayakata was like J.R. Singleton, where they had him on the practice squad the entire time. They weren't going to risk losing him, getting rid of him. He might have got elevated for a few games along the way, but they were not going to take him off the practice squad. J.R. Singleton is an athletic DT that was really productive in college, and he and Jared Ivey were coming on in training camp. Ivey ended up being the one that they stuck with on the roster. But Singleton is a guy that I could see next year, especially with some of the older players Seattle's got at DT. This could be a guy with another year to lift in the weight room, another year to really work at his technique stuff. He could end up being a real factor for the Seahawks in 2026. And the last name I'm going to point out here, because I mentioned it earlier, we're going to talk a lot about Kobe Bryant in the next few weeks, but he might be one of the most coveted free agents that the Seahawks have that's going to be hitting the market. And with Tayakata being on the roster, a lot of people might be saying, well, what's the point in talking about his safety? But I have the next Tayakata on this list, and that's Maxon Hook. I think Maxon Hook could be that next guy that in his second or even third season playing in this system, and Seattle hung on to him. Even after they re-signed or brought back Quandre Diggs, they weren't comfortable with him playing in a regular season game yet. Seattle was hesitant to do that with Tayakata when he was a rookie. But the fact they hung on to him after they got him off of waivers from the Eagles, that tells me that Mike Macdonald has got something in mind for him down the line. Maxon Hook could be the new Tayakata that becomes that fourth safety that has a chance to make some plays on special teams and maybe even play a few snaps on defense next year. That is another name that I'm watching very closely.
No question about it. You mentioned a couple of really good players there. I'll throw in one more just because you mentioned Ricky White. I think Tyrone Broden at the receiver position with Jake Bobo, with Derek Young, some guys that are the bigger bodied receivers on Seattle's current roster. I expect those players to come back. But Broden, with his size and his straight line speed, again, there is a scenario where you see Rashid Shaheed get a huge contract offer elsewhere. You see Jake Bobo or Cody White or Derek Young get some interest elsewhere. There's going to be a lot of NFL teams who are going to be willing to throw millions at guys that basically have only made a couple of million over their entire NFL careers. And they'd be silly not to explore some of those possibilities. Loyalty is big, but the loyalty these players feel is more towards their own families than to their teammates. I mean, let's just be real about that. And so, again, I think that any of the big-bodied wide receivers, Broden certainly has the size that might be able to give Seattle not only some insurance behind other fellow big-bodied wide receivers possibly leaving, but also your only real deep threat, at least healthy deep threat in Rashid Shaheed as well.
Yeah, there's a bunch of names that we can look at there. And look, what's fun about this is sometimes you have a guy that comes out of nowhere after another offseason. And maybe we're talking about Bubba Thomas battling Brandon Peely for a job next year. That's what's fun about this. Seattle's got a lot of young guys in that power of the 70. There will be some new rookies coming in as well. I expect with them having only 4 draft picks that this year that undrafted priority is going to be a bigger thing for the Seahawks too. So we'll get some fun players that we get to look at once we get to the spring, but certainly some exciting names on that list. They're going to be looking to take a step forward. And again, I call it the Tayakata list. Who's going to be that future reserve player that turns into a quality contributor for the Seahawks next season? When we come back, free agency, believe it or not, it's a month away. That's what happens when you play into February and you win the Super Bowl. The Seahawks have some big questions on the offensive side of the football. Maybe not the numbers that they have had in the past on that side of the ball, but still plenty of big decisions. We're going to be taking a first glance at Seattle's unrestricted, restricted, and exclusive rights free agents on offense coming up next year on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. The Winter Games are officially here, and if you're anything like us, you're locking in for events you only get to see on the biggest stage every 4 years, and that's why following the Winter Games on FanDuel just makes sense. From medal counts to individual events to finding your angle on the sports you care about most, FanDuel gives you more ways to stay connected to the action, whether it's the drama of curling matches that start slow and somehow get intense fast, speed skating races decided by inches, hockey games that feel different right from the opening face-off. Every niche event becomes must-watch when you're fully locked into the competition, and FanDuel keeps the entire Olympic experience engaging from start to finish. The Winter Games are on, and there's no better way to follow them than with FanDuel. FanDuel, play your game. Welcome back to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. He's Rob Rang. A special thanks to all the 12s tuning in, and thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate your support of the show. Free agency is just a little over a month away, and I know it might seem crazy, but that's what happens when you win the Super Bowl and your season ends later than anybody else. The offseason is there before you know, and we get 2 weeks until the NFL scouting combine. Things are going very quickly in offseason mode. Let's talk free agency. This is our first time diving into this free agent class for the Seahawks. And offensively, listeners are going to notice this. There's not a lot of names, which that's a good thing. You know, you don't want to have a million free agents that you have to make tough decisions on. And the Seahawks only have 4 unrestricted free agents on that side of the ball, Rob, but there's certainly some big names on there. MVP of the Super Bowl, Ken Walker III, the headliner, Rashid Shaheed, coming over from the Saints, midseason trade, instant impact player on offense and special teams. Josh Jones started and played really well for Charles Cross at the end of the year, a major upgrade with their swing tackle. And Derek Young, one of the best special teams players on Seattle's roster. All 4 of those players, I think you can make some strong arguments that the Seahawks should be trying to bring them back. But to me, Walker and Shaheed are the 2 top priorities on this list. And maybe Josh Jones is not far behind them just because how important that swing tackle position is. I do think that he is going to have some interest from other teams, though, for starting jobs with how he played in place of Charles Cross. And nobody would blame him for going somewhere else to start instead of being a backup again in Seattle.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think it's the opportunity to start for Josh Jones is going to be certainly a carrot that he's going to be interested in. I think that just multiple years on a contract. I mean, he signed with Seattle on a 1-year, $4 million deal this past season. And so I think that he is going to be looking for a raise. I mean, he did perform admirably against the Los Angeles Rams, and of course, one of the biggest games, regular or postseason of the year. And so I think that is tape that certainly he and his representatives are going to be, circulating out there to show what he was able to do. And he does have that swing versatility. He has the size. He's still a relatively young player, 28 years old. But as you said, Corbin, I mean, obviously the lead story here is that Seattle has got to make a big decision with Kenneth Walker III. As MVP, I think that he has just kind of upped the ante with every single game throughout the playoffs, and then, of course, capped it off in the Super Bowl. And so, this is a player who was drafted by Seattle in the second round. He's been in the NFL for 4 years. He's made roughly $8.5 million. I think he's going to get at least $8 million per year this upcoming season, perhaps even, perhaps talking about double digits. I looked at Spot Track or Spotrack, however you'd like to pronounce it. I apologize. But they are estimating 4-year, $36 million deal, obviously averaging out to $9 million per season. That would put him 11th, if I'm reading their chart correctly, 11th among NFL running backs this year. I think that he can justifiably get that from an NFL team. I just don't know that Seattle's going to. It's not about can you bring this player back right now, because obviously he deserves it. Obviously he's talented. Obviously he's a great fit in the offense. But the decisions you make for 2026 salary cap is going to impact the future negotiations you have for all your other superstars. And there is no position in the NFL that is easier to replace than running back. And so this isn't a great running back class. It's not a great running back free agent crop. I would argue that Kenneth Walker III is easily the top running back available in free agency. I do think that Seattle wants him back, but I also think that it is not the given that one might assume, given the fact that he was the NFL or the Super Bowl MVP and has played as well and as classily as he has throughout his time.
If they can get him on a $9 million per year deal, if I'm John Schneider, I am signing up for it. I give you a couple reasons why. One, Zach Charbonnet is not going to be back until probably the middle of next season. Do you really want to go into next year? And I like George Halani, but do you want to go into next season with George Halani and Kenny McIntosh, who's coming off an ACL tear of his own, as your top two running backs? And I think this locker room, Ken Walker is not a guy that says very much. He's a pretty soft-spoken dude, but he speaks a loud stick in terms of his actions. And I think that this locker room, you saw the way that they gravitated to him in this playoff run. And I just think that running backs, we're seeing with guys like Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley, like really good running backs for a long time, the shelf life was 7, 8, 9 years. And then suddenly everybody's like, well, the shelf life is 4. We don't really want to give a second contract. That's starting to change again because you're seeing guys like Barkley and Henry, really good running backs that are playing at a high level on a second or third contract. Ken Walker's 25 years old. It's not like he is an old guy. He is still very much in the prime of his career. And I just think the injury situation with Charbonnet, only having 4 picks, not a great free agent crop. I mean, there's a lot of reasons. But I think Seattle, $9 million per year, I think John Schneider would do that. And I think he understands the value of that position, especially if Justin Alton, who seemed to hit it off with Ken Walker, if those two end up working together with him being the OC, Alton, I could see that being something that whatever momentum they had here at the end of the season carries over to next year. And Ken Walker might be a top 5 back next year. At $9 million, I think that is worth it. But we'll see. Shaheed is the one that is really the question mark for me, just because Clint Kubiak and him have such a close relationship. And the Raiders, let's face it, the Raiders don't have a number 1 and they don't have a number 2. They have a couple really solid number 3 receivers. Maybe Trey Tucker's a number 2. But Rashid Shaheed would be easily their number 1 receiver right now. I don't know if that's a great fit for him personally. I think he's a very good 2. I don't know that he is the number 1, but he would be the number 1, head and shoulders above everybody else in Vegas for Fernando Mendoza as a rookie quarterback. So that's going to be the tale, is how much do the Raiders throw at him to reunite him with Clint Kubiak. And then if it's too much there, Seattle may say, you know what, we're getting Torrey Horton back healthy and we like Ricky White. Thanks, but no thanks. And say, look, yeah, we traded 2 mid-round picks. We got a Super Bowl out of it. Totally worth it for us. So that is one that could be a 50-50 proposition.
I get it. To me, it's very similar as the conversation we just had with Ken Walker III. Ideally, you bring them both back. It's just they both played such a critical role for Seattle's Super Bowl run here, obviously. At the same time, if if the flashy play earns him, a contract of $12 to $15 million per season, like some are projecting, then I just think that you have to wash your hands of him and let him go do his own thing. I mean, that's crazy money for a guy that, as you said, Corbin, and I agree, is a 2. And obviously he'd be the 2 in Seattle opposite JSN. So I think that you walk into this with the plan of like, okay, if the number is 9 million, 10 million, whatever it is for Kenneth Walker III, as we talked about before, then you make that initial offer. You give a good, strong offer. But again, you have to have a ceiling, is my point. And I think there's an awful lot of Seahawks fans who basically are just going to throw the ceiling out the window. You just won the Super Bowl. Of course, you have to bring Ken Walker back. Of course, you got to bring Rashid Shaheed back. I think, again, your ceiling might be that $9 to $10 million for the back, and probably more in that 8 to 9 million for a number 2 receiver, arguably the best return man in all of the NFL. There's no denying his talent, but at the same time, I think that there is other ways to maintain this as a Super Bowl winner, rather than going with just throwing money at guys that that you can replace in this particular draft class as well as in free agency.
And I think for a guy like Derek Young, as valuable as he is on special teams, like he's only got 5 or 6 catches in his entire NFL career. He's a very athletic guy. There could be some teams that throw him a bone and like, hey, we'll give you more of a chance to be a receiver here. And maybe Clint Kubiak wants to bring him in. That could be a possibility, but it seems like that'll be one that happens later in free agency, most likely, and a chance for them to bring him back as one of their core special teams players. As for the restricted and exclusive rights free agents, I don't know that any of the 3 restricted players are going to get tenders. Maybe Brady Russell, because he's such a great special teams player, and Cody White, Jake Bobo. I think those are guys that you try to work out separate contracts that aren't going to eat as much salary cap space. But I don't know that there's a player there that you're going to be jumping to put an original round tender that's multiple $1 million for next year. I don't know that there's a player on that list that Seattle's going to be doing that with, to be honest with you.
No, I agree with you. I think that, Seattle will make probably a qualifying tender for each of them because they like to keep them. But, I don't think that they're going to be doing anything that is going to, really surprise anybody by putting a first round tender on any of those players or anything in that stature.
Yeah, I don't see any of that happening. Certainly could see all three of those players being back, but we've seen a lot of times where the Seahawks have been able to negotiate. Last year, Josh Jobe was a great example, negotiating a separate deal that was a much lower cap hit, brought him back, had a little bit more guaranteed money on it. Seattle found a way to make that work. You could see them doing that. And George Halani with the running back situation, George Halani's going to be back, and exclusive rights free agents, it's basically a done deal. They just have to sign the contract. So I expect that George Halani is going to be there. The big questions are obviously going to be Shaheed and Ken Walker. Is Josh Jones back? I think that two of those players, Josh Jones, the Raiders might have him circled like, we're going to put you in our starting lineup right now for Clint Kubiak. So who knows what's going to happen on that front, but not a lot of question marks, but they got a few big ones there, particularly with Ken Walker and Rashid Shaheed. They're going to have to answer on the offensive side of the football. As always, you can follow me on X and Blue Sky at Corbin Smith NFL. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. And tons of draft content coming from Rob. Make sure to check him out on X at Rob Rang. I believe he dropped his latest mock draft today, so you can see where he's got the Seahawks going at pick number 32, potentially there. Make sure to check those out. We will be back tomorrow. I'll be teaming up with Nick Lee, and the two of us are going to have some fun with this or that, looking at some off-season related predictions. Which ones do we want to see? Which ones do we want to bypass on? Should be a lot of fun. Hope you'll be joining us on Blue Friday, our first one to Super Bowl champions. Tune in. We'll see you later. Thanks. Go Hawks.